Who are the most important players for the San Jose Sharks entering the 2024-2025 season?
You're Locked On Sharks, your daily podcast on the San Jose Sharks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to Locked On Sharks, the premier hockey podcast covering your favorite team in the Bay Area. My name is JD Young, caretaker at the Reef, also the co-host of Western Conference Tuesdays on the Locked On NHL channel. I want to thank you for making Locked On Sharks your first listen, proudly part of the Locked On Network. We cover your team every day. And if you want to be an everyday, all you have to do is just follow wherever you get podcasts, or you can watch on YouTube as well. And I am back from vacation. Thankfully, Mike Grier gave me a break, didn't do anything crazy. So we're going to be looking at 4 players who I think are the most important Sharks. We did this exercise last year where I mentioned I thought William Eklund was the most important player on the San Jose Sharks last year. William Eklund had a really great first season. I think we know who are the most important players. It's going to be kind of a shared title for this. But so we're going to look at some of these guys who I think are kind of, their seasons are very important for the Sharks, and not just this season, but for the long-term success of the franchise. So before we get into all that, do want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, the most important players for the San Jose Sharks. It's Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini, right? And what I wanted to kind of focus on this part was, what lessons can we learn from William Eklund, who entered last season as the most important San Jose Shark because of how his development would go? I think really would kind of set the foundation for Eklund's career. Eklund had his ups and downs last year, right? But overall, I would say it was a successful season. So what did Mike Grier and now new head coach Ryan Warsofsky, who was, of course, on the staff last year, what did they learn from Eklund's development, and how can they apply that to Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith to make their transitions into the NHL much easier? Eklund did have a little bit of a, he had a little bit smoother or more gradual, I guess. Basically, playing from the SHL and then spending the entire season in the AHL and then jumping into the NHL, right? It's a little bit more gradual transition for Eklund after his draft. Celebrini is going to go, and Will Smith are both going to go straight from the NCAA into playing NHL. Macklin Celebrini, of course, 18. Will Smith, 19. A little bit, of course, younger, less experience. But I think the Sharks took some of the lessons that they learned from last year and applied them this offseason to make sure that Smith and Celebrini are put into a better position to succeed and not have to kind of maybe deal with some of the issues that Eklund did last year, right? And I think the biggest issue that Eklund dealt with last year was just poor line mates. How often, Luke Cunnin, who, God bless his soul, having to kind of play second line minutes, and most teams Luke Cunnin is not sniffing second line minutes, and Luke Cunnin played, he played his hardest in those minutes. But I think what Grier did this offseason in trying to better insulate the team in case you have injuries like Logan Couture playing all but 6 games last season, Tomas Hertl missing chunks of the season and then getting traded, Mikael Granlund, who started this season injured, right? We never saw a full game with all those guys and Nico Sturm in the same game. Like, they all missed. We never got one game with all those guys in a game. So the Sharks, I think this offseason went out and were more aggressive about making sure that the Sharks have better top line talent. So you have Mikael Granlund, of course, they acquired last offseason. Getting a guy like Alex Wenberg, who I think can play up and down the lineup. He can play center, he can play wing, gives them a lot more flexibility there. You have Tyler Toffoli, who, again, a legitimate top six player, walking 25 goal scorer. You have Fabian Zetterlund, who established himself as a top six forward, and William Eklund, who I think also established himself as a top six forward. So for guys like Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith now, hoping Eklund continues his development, but it should be considered we kind of know what Eklund's going to be right now, or at least where his trajectory is heading. Zetterlund, like, we feel like he can maybe take another step and be a potential 30 goal scorer this season. But I think what it does, though, what Mike Grier did was, especially in the top there, getting Wenberg, and then getting Toffoli, as well as Celebrini and Will Smith now, you have more overlap. So if a guy does miss, a couple weeks here and there, because of injuries, right, or whatever, you're not losing, like, these guys aren't going to be losing valuable skill players to play with them. And I think that was a huge lesson Mike Grier learned. And I would if you got Mike Grier, injected him with some true serum, I'm sure he would say, yes, the goal was to try to acquire the number one overall pick. And, maybe that's why we weren't as aggressive last offseason, et cetera, et cetera. Mission accomplished, right? That's why we have Macklin Celebrini on this team. But the change, kind of the flip, though, for Grier this offseason was making sure that there's just more talented players for these guys to kind of lean on. And then also more depth, especially in the bottom six, so that way you're not having to kind of pull guys who are supposed to be on the Barracuda all season, like a Ryan Carpenter or Justin Bailey. And those guys played well in last year in their kind of roles in the NHL, but those guys are supposed to be in the AHL. Like, the plan is to have those guys in the AHL all season. But with some of the moves, claiming Barclay Goodrow, trading for Ty Dellinger, trading for Carl Grundstrom, the Sharks have really solidified their forward department. So you're not having to ask guys like Luke Cunnin play second line center at the end of the season. And I think this is going to help these guys, Celebrini and Smith, because you're going to be able to play with skilled players, right? And skilled players playing with skilled players, that's where they're going to put themselves in the best position to succeed. And, we can discuss at some point here when training camp kicks off, or before training camp kind of lines and all that fun stuff. But I think, though, for Smith and Celebrini, you're really in a position to be in a much better spot than William Eklund was in last year. And I think also another thing, too, that was really smart was pairing Smith and Celebrini with someone to live with, right? Celebrini is going to be living with Joe Thornton, who has kind of seen it all and done it all, with the exception of winning a Stanley Cup, than Joe Thornton, right? Joe Thornton, who was the number one overall pick. Joe Thornton, who at first maybe felt like, in Boston wasn't living up to expectations. Joe Thornton, who was traded. Joe Thornton, who won a Hart Trophy. Like, Joe Thornton, who's been there and done that, excruciating playoff losses. Someone who's been through the rigors, I think, is a perfect guy for Celebrini to live with. And, for Marleau, kind of adopted Will Smith for the season, the same thing, right? What is Marleau basically not done in the NHL? A guy who knows how to take care of his body, doesn't miss games, plays in there, set the NHL record for games played. I think these are great. And I mean, Marlowe's kids are literally like a couple of years younger than Will Smith. So I think this was really smart of Grier to, one, on the ice, make sure they have more talented players to play with, and two, off the ice, pairing them with former players that they can kind of lean on in those, like, you get home from the rink after a tough night and you're kind of sitting quietly in your room and there's Joe Thornton to talk to, and like having those conversations with Joe Thornton, at 1 a.m. I think that's a really important and invaluable experience for Celebrini and for Will Smith to have those opportunities. So I think Mike Grier's done a much better job of kind of putting these guys in a much better position to succeed than what we saw from William Eklund. William Eklund, I think, had a really great season last year. But I think Mike Grier learned some lessons from that and applied those, especially when you're dealing with the face of the franchise and Macklin Celebrini here. So yes, the two most important players in San Jose this year are Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini. So we're going to talk about some other important players and Shakir Mukhamadullin and Askarov, and kind of their development and kind of what's next for them, and other lessons that we could potentially learn going forward. So we'll get to that here in just 1 second. You've heard us talk about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, now we have something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5, get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And if you're like me, I live out of market in my beloved Miami Dolphins, but with YouTube TV, I can watch Tua to Tyreek every week. And that's a beautiful thing. So with a YouTube-based plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. You can cancel at any time. Just visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. All right. Shakir Mukhamadullin. Very also important player, right? Mukhamadullin, who was acquired in the Timo Meier trade, kind of one of the big pieces, right? You have the first-round pick, which turned out to be Quentin Musty, Fabian Zetterlund, who has really blossomed into his own type of player, and I think is going to have a big season for San Jose this year. Hopefully earn himself a nice contract as well. But then Shakir Mukhamadullin, right? Last season, I think really you saw his growth especially in the defensive zone. But you saw his growth as he made that transition from playing over in the KHL to playing North American hockey and playing in the AHL. To get a taste of NHL action, it was 3 games, and would have been more if he was healthy at the end of the season. But I think he's important because the Sharks' blue line is sneaky old, right? You look at what the Sharks are kind of doing on the blue line, and it is it's a lot of gray beards back there. So you have, of course, Mark-Edward Vlasic, who's 37, and 2 more years left on his contract. You have next Jan Ruda, 1 year left on his contract. You do also have Matt Benning, who's 30, Cody Ceci, who's also 30. So you have 4 guys right there who are 30 or older. Jake Wallman's 28, so we're kind of hitting that peak, starting to kind of go over the peak for him. And then Mario Ferrara's 25. Henry Thrun's 23, and then you have, of course, and then Shakir Mukhamadullin. It's important for Mukhamadullin this season to establish himself as a everyday NHL player, because the Sharks this blue line is going to look very different here in the next couple seasons. And it's not like in the AHL, they have a ton of guys who I think are kind of ready to break down, kind of bust down the door, Yes, you have Shakir Mukhamadullin and Jack Thompson, who I think Thompson's kind of in the same spot, and maybe just kind of a slot behind Mukhamadullin right now, but both these guys are 22 and need to kind of establish themselves. Henry Thrun, who's, earned himself a nice contract this offseason, probably going to be like a 4th, 5th, 6th defenseman. You've got Gannon Larocque, who's been having trouble staying in, kind of with his injuries. Luca Cagnoni, and Jake Furlong are hoping to both to kind of make the Barracuda this season. And then you have Sam Dickinson, the 1st-round pick from this year, who's probably honestly 2 years away from playing NHL games. There's not like it feels like a little bit of a gap there between kind of who the Sharks have now and who's going to be ready to play NHL games for the next couple seasons. So I think for the Sharks and for Mike Grier, having Mukhamadullin kind of maybe check a box this season and establish himself as an everyday NHL player would be a big sigh of relief, because then that just makes that Timo Meier trade even better, right? If you get Quint Musty to hopefully continue his development and become what we all think Quint Musty can potentially be. Fabian Zetterlund turned into a really nice, kind of second line winger, or kind of maybe overqualified third line winger. And then Shakir Mukhamadullin maybe turns into a second pairing, kind of a high end second pairing defenseman. That's a really nice win for Mike Grier, and especially at a trade that all of us, myself included, thought looked really bad at the time. But they got to produce. And I think this is a big year for Mukhamadullin to kind of do that. And it was kind of cool. It was cool to see him as part of like the Topps rookie, was it Topps or whoever, like the rookie NHL rookie kind of thing, where Smith and Celebrini were there, and then also Shakir Mukhamadullin. So maybe reading too much into it, but the hope is, I guess, that now Mukhamadullin can win himself an NHL job this training camp. And there's a lot of competition, and that's something we'll dig into here probably early next week, looking at some of the training camp battles that I'm most intrigued by. But I really think, though, for Mukhamadullin, kind of taking what you learn, you see how well he moves. His pivots are still a little iffy, especially with kind of having to do that 180 pivot from going like backwards to skating forwards. But I still think he moves really, really well, especially in small areas, especially along the boards. He's learning to use his size to his advantage, and was one of my favorite players to kind of watch with the Barracuda. His game really, really grew on me last season, and I really expect him to kind of take that next step now. Maybe he doesn't win a job right out of camp, but I don't think it's going to be long before Mukhamadullin is given an opportunity. And for the Sharks, right, you want these young guys to, one, yes, earn a job, but at some point you have to give them opportunity to earn a job. I just went through the ages of the Sharks defense core. None of these guys are signed after the 25-26 season. Like the Sharks could have in 2 years from now, the Sharks could have a completely different blue line. I don't expect it. I expect Henry Thrun to kind of stick around, and we'll see what happens with Mario Ferraro and, Jake Wallman, who I think could potentially kind of stick around. But these other guys, like, yeah, they might help the Sharks defense now, but in the long run, is it going to be more beneficial for Shakir Mukhamadullin to kind of take his lumps now when, yes, the team's going to be very young and they're going to have their issues, and I expect them to be more competitive, but I don't expect them to win a lot of games. Is it better for a guy like Shakir Mukhamadullin to kind of grow with these young players like a Celebrini and a Will Smith, and you can also partner him with veteran players like Jan Rudas or Vlasic, who can play, has played both sides, or Matt Benny, like with some of these guys that are veterans, and that way you help his transition a little bit better. So I'm really intrigued to see what the development plan is for Mukhamadullin, and how they kind of take the training wheels off for him and let him to kind of get used to being an NHL player, and allow him to kind of to hopefully hit that next stage for him. And what I think is an important year for him as he enters the last year of his ELC. And yes, the Sharks will own his rights as he's an RFA. But like, you have decisions to make, et cetera, et cetera. And it'd be nice to have a bigger sample size of NHL games with Shakir Mukhamadullin going forward. So yeah, he's the most important blue liner. We're going to be talking about the most important goalie, and it's Askarov. So we'll get to Askarov and kind of what discuss kind of what his timeline and what his why his importance, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get to that here in just 1 second. All right, guys, before we continue, we talk about Askarov's importance and, of course, how the Sharks are going to implement him and make sure he gets NHL games. Do want to thank you guys, of course, for making the Locked On Sharks your first listen, probably part of the Locked On Network. We cover your team every day. For your second listen, go check out one of the other great shows here at Locked On. Of course, you have Locked On NHL, was still putting out 5 episodes a week. Seth and I are doing burning questions for every Western Conference team. So we'll have that for you on Tuesday. Or you can check out one of the other great shows here in the Bay Area, right? You've got Locked On Niners, get you guys ready for the Niners Jets game on Monday night. You also have Locked On Warriors, Locked On A's, Locked On Giants. Plenty of great stuff here at the Locked On Network. So make sure you guys are following wherever you get podcasts, or you can watch on YouTube as well, where we cover your team every day. All right. Yaroslav Askarov. He's pretty important, right? Sharks just traded a first-round pick for Askarov a couple of weeks ago. And the importance for him is, right, you've kind of put a lot of eggs in the Askarov basket, right? Because the Sharks just don't really have a guy that you feel like is going to be that guy in the net. And yes, I know they drafted some goalies. You know, they drafted Kirch and they drafted another Yaroslav. They have 2 Yaroslavs in pipes right now. Cortis, their 7th round pick from this year. So you have these guys here that you think maybe could be like something down the line, but it takes so long for them to develop, you know. And Georgi Romanov, who I think played really, really well for San Jose, for the Barracuda last year, and was an, you know, undrafted guy who they signed out of middle of nowhere Russia. I thought played really well and looks to be potential kind of backup type of goalie and should get a fair amount of starts in the AHL this season. But Askarov, right, if you spend a first round pick on a guy and we don't know where that pick's going to be, the Vegas pick's going to be, you hope he plays well, right? And Askarov is a former first round pick himself. And I think for Askarov, and Mike Grier and Ryan Warsofsky, is what's the development path for him, right? And we know Askarov, he wanted a chance to play NHL games for Nashville. And we knew that wasn't going to be a thing for them, especially after they signed UC Saros to 8 years. Like Askarov is just never going to be the guy in Nashville. For San Jose, I expect Askarov to play a ton of games in the Barracuda. But how do you get him some games in the NHL? Maybe it's like a once a week type of thing, and especially with Askarov, who is still on his ELC, so you can move him up and down without any issue. It's pretty easy to kind of just call guys up and send guys down. Like it's not a problem. Like, and you can, somebody's always injured. So like, don't worry about roster spots. If you can make it work, right? Is it maybe you get it once a week? Maybe you bring him, kind of bring him up, play him for a game, send him back down type of scenario, which, right? But there needs to be a plan, because you want Askarov to be this guy and get NHL games and see if your investment is going to be worth it. And he's played a ton of games in the AHL. He's played really well in the AHL. Yes, he's had some issues in the playoffs that, I talked with the Locked On Preds girls about that, potential maturity issues there. And that's going to be, how does he handle maybe getting stuck in the Barracuda? That's a question that Mike Grier, I think, is going to have to be very clear in how to try to answer that question and make sure there's a plan in place for Askarov. But if Askarov can, 15 starts is kind of where I've got the over under at for him. I I think that's a fair amount, and especially if, again, maybe it's once a week or once every couple weeks, you get him up, let him play a game, and then you send him back down, let him continue to kind of hone his craft in the AHL, and then if somebody gets hurt, we know Blackwood has struggled with injuries, or after the trade deadline, if one of those guys is traded, does he get to make sure he gets a lion's share of starts at the end of the season to really propel himself into a bigger workload heading into the 25-26 season? So I think for Askarov, it's important for him, because if he hits, it solves so many questions. We've discussed this a lot here, especially after the trade. But if he hits, that is your biggest question in your pipeline, and your prospect pool gets answered. He signed for the next 2 seasons after this, to $2 million contract for each season. So it's not like he's gonna be here, but it would be nice to again get him that bigger sample size, kind of like with Mukhamadullin, right? Let him kind of work in that next level and prepare himself to be an everyday NHL player. Or for Askarov, start gearing him up to be a 45, 50, 55 start goalie in the future, and especially as the team continues to grow. So I think it's a big season for Askarov. As he's going to get an opportunity to play NHL games, right? He's going to get that opportunity, and he's going to get a chance to, I think, sooner rather than later, be the guy for San Jose and really put a nice bow on what's been a great offseason for Mike Grier. So that's going to be it for me today. We'll be back later this week, where we're gonna, of course, get you guys ready for Rookie Face Off. We got some other good stuff coming here at Locked On Sharks. Make sure you're following along wherever you get podcasts, and of course, you can watch on YouTube as well. Follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Locked On Sharks. Follow me on Twitter at MyFryHole. Until Wednesday, bye, friends.